The neon lights of the Sands Hotel and Casino shimmered against the desert sky, glowing like a promise. Inside, the air carried the soft hum of anticipation, glasses clinking, a piano warming up backstage, waiters moving like quiet shadows between velvet-covered tables. It was the early 1960s, and Las Vegas was booming. The stage at the Copa Room was the beating heart of glamour and grit. And on that particular night, the spotlight belonged to one of the most electrifying performers in America, Sammy Davis Jr. Backstage, Sammy stood before the mirror, adjusting his bow tie. His reflection stared back at him, sharp suit, confident smile, eyes that had seen more than applause. He had danced across Broadway, sung before presidents, and endured storms that would have broken lesser spirits. But no matter how high he climbed, there were still rooms where his presence felt him tested. A soft knock came at the door. 5 minutes, Sam, said a stagehand. Sammy nodded, then exhaled slowly. Let's give them something they'll never forget. From down the hallway came a familiar laugh, smooth, relaxed, unmistakable. Dean Martin strolled in, tuxedo crisp, a glass of sparkling water in hand. You ready to steal the show again? Dean asked with a crooked grin. Sammy chuckled. Only if you promise not to follow me. Dean leaned against the wall. Kid, I don't follow anybody. The two shared a look, not just colleagues, not just co-stars. They were brothers in rhythm, members of a legendary circle the world would later call the Rat Pack. But tonight wasn't about reputation. It was about something deeper. Out in the audience, the room was packed. Businessmen in tailored suits. Women in elegant gowns. Tourists hoping to brush shoulders with fame. And at a corner table near the stage sat a wealthy oil man from out of state, loud, confident, and already on his third drink. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the incomparable Sammy Davis Jr. The curtain parted. The applause was instant, swelling like a wave. Sammy stepped into the spotlight, his presence magnetic. He launched into a high-energy number, tapping across the stage with impossible precision. His voice soared, rich, vibrant, full of life. The crowd leaned in, captivated. Except for one. At the corner table, the old man scoffed. He muttered something under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. A couple at the next table stiffened. A waiter paused mid-step. The old man took another sip and said it again, this time louder, a cutting remark about Sammy's race and his place. The words hung in the air like smoke. On stage, Sammy kept performing. Years of experience had taught him how to read a room without breaking rhythm. He saw the man, heard the tone, felt the shift in energy. But he didn't falter. He transitioned into a softer number, his voice lowering into something intimate. The spotlight narrowed. The crowd quieted. Then the old man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that didn't belong in a room filled with music. Why don't you sing something from the back door where you came from? He shouted. The room froze. Forks stopped midair. Glasses hovered inches from lips. The band faltered for half a second before catching the tempo again. Sammy's smile didn't disappear, but it changed. It became tighter, controlled, professional. He finished the song. Applause followed, hesitant at first, then louder, as if the audience wanted to drown out what had just happened. Backstage, Dean Martin had heard everything. He stood still, jaw set, not in rage, but in something colder. Disappointment. Not in Sammy. In the world. A stage manager rushed toward him. Dean, we can have security remove him. Dean raised a hand. No. Sir. Dean's eyes were steady. Let him stay. The manager blinked. But I know what he did. Dean placed his glass down carefully. Trust me. Back on stage, Sammy finished his set to a standing ovation. He bowed deeply, thanked the audience, and walked off with dignity intact. But once backstage, he exhaled the breath he'd been holding. Dean was waiting. You okay? Dean asked softly. Sammy shrugged. It's not the first time. Dean's voice dropped. Doesn't make it right. Sammy gave a small smile. You don't have to fix every fool in the world, Dino. Dean's eyes flickered. Maybe not. But sometimes, you remind them who they're dealing with. Before Sammy could respond, the announcer returned to the mic. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the one and only, Dean Martin. The applause was thunderous. Dean walked onto the stage slowly, soaking in the energy. He adjusted the microphone and gave the audience his signature half-smile. Good evening, folks, he began casually. Beautiful night, isn't it? Light laughter. He glanced toward the corner table. The old man leaned back confidently, unaware. Dean began with a playful tune, his voice smooth as velvet. The crowd relaxed again. Tension eased. Then, midway through the song, Dean stopped. Completely. The band fell silent. Dean looked out over the audience, scanning the room deliberately. His gaze landed on the old man. You know, Dean said calmly, I've had the privilege of sharing this stage with some of the finest talents in the world. A pause. And there's one man who just walked off this stage who has more talent in his little finger than most of us have in our whole bodies. Applause erupted instantly. Dean nodded. That man is my brother. The old man shifted uncomfortably. Dean continued, voice steady but firm. And in this room, under this roof, we treat family with respect. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. The room grew still again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't fear. It was solidarity. Dean raised his glass. If you can't clap for him, he said quietly, you can leave. Silence. Every eye turned toward the corner table. The old man's face flushed. He looked around. No one met his gaze with agreement. Even his own companions avoided eye contact. A moment stretched long. Then slowly, awkwardly, he stood. A chair scraped loudly against the floor. Without another word, he walked toward the exit. The room parted to let him through. The door closed behind him with a soft thud. And just like that, the air changed. Dean waited a beat. Then he smiled again. Now, where were we? The band struck up the music. This time, the applause wasn't just for entertainment. It was for courage. Backstage, Sammy watched from the wings, eyes shining not with tears, but with something deeper. Belonging. When Dean finished his set, he walked straight back to Sammy. You didn't have to do that, Sammy said quietly. Dean shrugged. Yeah. I did. Sammy looked at him for a long moment. You know that might cost you. Dean smirked. Kid, some things are worth the price. Outside, the neon lights of Las Vegas continued to flicker. The desert wind swept across the strip. Most people would forget the specifics of that night. But they would remember the feeling. They would remember a room that chose respect over hatred. They would remember a performer who kept singing. And another who refused to stay silent. Because sometimes, the most powerful note in a song is the one that stops the music entirely. The door of the Copa room closed behind the disgraced patron. But the echo of the moment lingered long after the applause faded. Inside the Sands Hotel and Casino, the show went on. Outside, however, whispers had already begun. In the early 1960s, Las Vegas was a city built on image. Reputation mattered, casino owners guarded it carefully, and performers were expected to entertain, not challenge the comfort of high-paying guests. What happened that night was more than a brief confrontation. It was a line drawn in public. Backstage, Sammy Davis Jr. removed his jacket slowly, his movements measured. Years in the spotlight had trained him to maintain composure, but he understood the unspoken rules of the era. There were doors that opened easily for some and remained closed for others. He had learned to walk through resistance with grace. Across the hall, Dean Martin sat alone for a moment before returning to the dressing room. The easygoing charm he wore on stage had faded. In its place was quiet resolve. A knock came at the door. It was one of the casino executives, his expression tight but controlled. Dean, he began carefully, we support you. Of course we do. But that gentleman was a major investor's guest. These situations can get complicated. Dean met his gaze calmly. Complicated how? There could be calls. Complaints. We have to protect the house. Dean leaned back in his chair. The house is fine. The music's fine. The only thing that wasn't fine was what he said. The executive shifted his weight. We just don't want trouble. Dean's reply was steady. Trouble starts when good people pretend not to hear bad things. The man left without another word, the air between them heavy but respectful. Later that night, as the strip quieted and the neon lights dimmed, Dean and Sammy stepped outside together. The desert air felt cooler than usual. You know this might follow you, Sammy said quietly. Dean shrugged. Let it. Sammy studied him. Not everyone's willing to risk their contracts. Dean gave a small smile. I didn't get into this business to count chairs at tables. I got into it for the music. And the people who make it worth singing. Sammy nodded, though he knew the reality was more fragile than either of them admitted. The entertainment world was powerful, and public stances could carry private consequences. Within days, phone calls did come. There were murmurs that Dean had embarrassed a wealthy client. A columnist hinted that emotions had run high at the Sands. Some suggested that performers should remain neutral. But something else happened too. Letters arrived at the hotel. Guests praised the stand that had been taken. Fellow performers quietly expressed admiration. Stagehands and waiters who had witnessed the moment spoke of it with pride. In dressing rooms and rehearsal halls, the story spread not as gossip, but as proof. One afternoon, during rehearsal with members of the Rat Pack, the mood was lighter than expected. Jokes were exchanged. Laughter filled the room. Yet beneath it all was understanding. The bond among them had strengthened. Not because of conflict, but because of clarity. That evening, Sammy returned to the stage. There was no announcement, no reference to what had happened. The spotlight found him as it always did. But something felt different. The applause came quicker, louder. Not out of sympathy, but recognition. He began to sing. His voice carried not just melody, but message. It moved through the room with quiet strength, no anger. No bitterness. Just presence. From the side of the stage, Dean watched. He did not need to say anything more. The statement had already been made. In the weeks that followed, bookings continued. The Sands did not collapse. The crowds did not disappear. If anything, the performances grew sharper, more alive. The Ullman's name faded into obscurity. But the memory of that night endured. Years later, people would speak about glamour and fame, about the golden era of Las Vegas. They would remember tuxedos, laughter, and music echoing into the desert sky. But those who had been in the room would remember something deeper. They would remember that respect had been defended without shouting, that dignity had been preserved without violence, that one man kept singing, and another refused to let silence become agreement. In a city built on bright lights. It was a simple act of loyalty that shone the brightest, and sometimes, that is the real performance. Time moved forward, as it always does, but certain nights refused to fade. Weeks after the incident at the Sands Hotel and Casino, the story had traveled far beyond the glowing strip of Las Vegas. It wasn't printed in bold headlines. It wasn't discussed in official press conferences. But in dressing rooms, jazz clubs, and radio studios across the country, people spoke about it quietly. They spoke about the moment when Dean Martin had chosen to stop a show instead of ignoring an insult. They spoke about how Sammy Davis Jr. had continued performing with dignity when it would have been easier to walk off stage. For Sammy, life did not suddenly become simpler. He still faced hotel entrances that were less welcoming. There were cities where separate accommodations were suggested under polite language. Success did not erase prejudice. It only exposed it more clearly. Yet something inside him had shifted. He realized that night had not been only about humiliation or defense. It had been about visibility. When someone stands beside you in public, especially in a time when silence is safer, it changes how you carry yourself afterward. One afternoon, Sammy sat alone in a rehearsal hall, tapping lightly on the piano keys. A melody formed, soft and reflective. He thought about his childhood in vaudeville, about long train rides and smoky theaters. He thought about the doors that had opened slowly, and the ones that had closed firmly. Dean entered quietly, listening for a moment before speaking. "That one's different," Dean said. Sammy smiled faintly. "Feels different." Dean took a seat nearby. "You know, I never planned to make a statement that night." Sammy glanced at him. "You didn't look like you were planning anything." Dean chuckled softly. "I just knew I couldn't pretend I didn't hear it." That honesty hung between them. In the early 1960s, America itself was in transition. Conversations about equality were growing louder. Courage was appearing in unexpected places. Musicians, actors, and athletes were beginning to understand that the stage could be more than entertainment. It could be influence. The members of the Rat Pack had always been known for style and swagger. But beneath the tuxedos and humor, there was loyalty. The incident at the Sands had quietly reinforced that bond. Invitations soon arrived for performances outside Nevada. In some cities, crowds seemed especially attentive. There was a sense that audiences were watching not only for talent, but for character. During one show in Chicago, Sammy paused between songs. The room was packed. The lights glowed warmly over the crowd. "I've learned something lately," he said into the microphone. "Music sounds better when everyone feels welcome to hear it." The audience responded with steady applause. Dean, waiting in the wings, understood the weight of those simple words. They were not confrontational. They were not political speeches. They were reflections shaped by lived experience. Backstage after the show, a young stagehand approached Sammy. His voice was hesitant. "Sir," he said, "I just wanted to say, thank you." Sammy studied the young man's nervous expression. "For what?" Sammy asked gently. "For not backing down." The comment lingered long after the stage lights dimmed. Dean heard about it later that evening. He leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "Funny thing," he said, "sometimes you don't know who's watching." Sammy nodded. "Or who needs to see it." The entertainment world continued spinning. Contracts were signed. Songs climbed charts. Applause filled theaters. Yet the memory of that night at the Sands became something steady beneath the surface. It was not about revenge or humiliation. The man who had shouted had long since faded from relevance. What remained was the example. An example that strength can be calm. That loyalty can be quiet but powerful. That dignity, once defended, stands taller. Years later, when interviews would revisit the golden era of Las Vegas, stories of glamour and excess would surface first. But occasionally, someone would mention a night when the music stopped for a different reason. And in those retellings, the focus was never on anger. It was on courage shared between two men under a single spotlight. Years passed, and the glow of the early 1960s slowly softened into memory. The bright marquees along the strip still flickered, and the Sands Hotel and Casino remained a symbol of show business at its peak. But for those who had stood inside that room on the night everything shifted, the memory never truly dimmed. By then, Sammy Davis Jr. had become more than a performer. He was a symbol of excellence that refused to bend. His talent had always been undeniable. Now, his presence carried added weight. Audiences did not just come to hear him sing or watch him dance. They came to witness a man who had endured and continued. In quiet interviews years later, Sammy would rarely revisit that specific evening. He preferred to focus on the work, on the craft. But those close to him understood how much it meant. Not because of the insult, but because of the response. Dean Martin, known for effortless charm and relaxed humor, rarely spoke about it either. He would brush it off with a casual remark, as if stopping a room cold was as ordinary as ordering dinner. Yet those who knew him understood something deeper. His silence about it was not indifference. It was humility. The entertainment industry continued to evolve. Conversations about equality became louder across America. Public figures were asked to take clearer positions. For some, it was uncomfortable. For others, necessary. One evening, during a reunion performance with members of the Rat Pack, the energy backstage felt familiar. The laughter was the same. The tuxedos were just as sharp. But there was a maturity in the air that hadn't existed before. As the curtain rose, the applause thundered through the theater. Dean stepped forward first, delivering a smooth opening number. The audience swayed with the rhythm. Then he paused, glancing toward the wings. Every great show, he said evenly, is built on great company. He gestured toward the side of the stage. Sammy walked out to a standing ovation. There was no reference to the past. No dramatic retelling. None was needed. The crowd knew what they were witnessing. Two artists who had stood together when it mattered. They performed a duet that night, their voices blending effortlessly. The harmony felt symbolic, as if it carried more than melody. It carried history. Backstage afterward, a reporter approached Dean with a simple question. Do you think entertainers have a responsibility beyond performing? Dean thought for a moment before answering. I think everyone has a responsibility, he said calmly. Doesn't matter if there's a spotlight or not. Sammy, standing nearby, gave a small nod. The truth was simple. What had happened years earlier was not about confrontation. It was about boundaries. About reminding a room that talent has no color. That respect is not optional. The man who had shouted that night was forgotten. His words held no legacy. But the response to him became part of something larger. It became a quiet lesson passed from stage to stage, from one generation of performers to the next. Young artists who grew up hearing the story understood that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it speaks softly and refuses to move. In the final years of their careers, both men carried countless accolades and achievements. Awards lined shelves. Records sold in the millions. Yet among the many performances that defined them, one stood apart. It was the night when the music stopped. The night when dignity was defended without violence. The night when loyalty proved louder than hatred. Long after the lights dimmed at the sands and the desert wind swept across the empty parking lot, the echo of that moment remained. Not as a scandal. Not as controversy. But as proof that character endures longer than applause. And sometimes, the most powerful performance is not the one that earns cheers. It is the one that earns respect.